Over the past few days, we've looked at Reconstruction and Southern efforts to redeem the South. Over the next few weeks, we will be drawing out the consequences of redemption, from cultural changes to changes in the Southern economy to the rise of social and economic segregation. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most important consequences of the end of Reconstruction and the redemption of the South, a real cultural change. In the decades following the Civil War, Southerners began reshaping the memory of that conflict, the Confederacy, and the legacy of slavery. What we see in this effort is the creation of the Lost Cause. This effort began as soon as the war ended. It initially emerged in an effort to remember soldiers of the Confederacy who died during the war, and occurred largely thanks to women who spearheaded what we will call the Memorial Movement. Beginning in 1865, Southern women, many who had lost husbands, sons, and fathers, began joining together in organizations to create and care for cemeteries for the dead. Many groups took the same name, the Ladies' Memorial Association. The association had a simple mission, which was to care for those affected by the war. These groups not only lobbied for places to bury the dead, but also worked to get financial support for veterans, to comfort and care for war widows and orphans, and generally to speak for those lost in battle. During the war, most dead soldiers were buried near where they fell, and the Ladies' Memorial Association's primary task was burial. So, the association accepted bodies from battlefields to interring graveyards. Once the war ended, some of the larger associations were able to make trips to Gettysburg, Antietam, and other major battlefields to bring back local dead. After reburying as many as possible, the LMAs started a tradition of taking one day a year to pay special tribute to the fallen, clean cemeteries, and put flowers on graves. It was known as Decoration Day, or usually called Memorial Day. The day was not just for widows and veterans, though. Memorial Day became an opportunity for everyone in the community to remember, and it was marked by graveside activities as well as poetry readings, church services, speeches by local leaders, all memorializing the dead. This memorialization was the first step in creating a memory of the war. In remembering the dead, Southerners spent very little time thinking about the broader meaning of the conflict. Instead, remembrance was personal, focusing on the loss of a husband, brother, son, neighbor, or friend who died, and what that death said about him. By the mid to late 1870s, Memorial Day and memorialization was becoming a common part of Southern life. Memorialization of the war and its participants was not limited to the LMA either. In the wake of the conflict, two major veterans groups emerged in the United States, one remembering the Union and another the Confederacy. The Union organization was the Grand Army of the Republic. It was formed soon after the war to meet the needs of Union veterans. The GAR fought for pensions, marshaled veterans' votes, and scheduled get-togethers. The Confederate organization, the United Confederate Veterans, was founded later, but like its northern counterpart, also fought to recognize the needs of veterans. Additionally, organizations began to include non-veterans and auxiliary groups. Only veterans could join the UCV, but by the 1890s there were also organizations such as the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. These began as a way for family members to take part in the memorial activities, but they soon expanded to provide for wider participation in larger wartime remembrance. It was clear that remembrance itself was changing. It was no longer just about respecting the fallen. It was increasingly about remembering the living, and even about celebrating sacrifice. In June of 1870, former Confederate General Wade Hampton, who would later serve as the South Carolina governor and serve in the U.S. Senate, spoke to a crowd of about 6,000 in Charleston at the dedication of a monument to South Carolinians who had died in the war. In his speech, he asserted that Southerners had a sacred duty to, and I quote, vindicate their motives, to praise their patriotism, to commend their example, and to protect their memory. He went on to say, these are the duties which devolve upon us, the sad survivors of that gallant band who, at the call of their state, rallied to her defense. Mourning over the graves of our slain, who, for faith and freedom, lay slaughtered in vain, standing amid the wreck of our dearest hopes, looking at the ruin of our country, witnessing the steady but rapid overthrow of Republican institutions and constitutional liberty, what is left to cheer us to future exertion but the hallowed memories of the past, that past which was made so glorious by our great dead? We know that the men whose names are written on that marble believed, as firmly as they did in the existence of God, in the justice of the cause for which they died. We place them high on the roll of those patriotic and heroic dead who make up the great army of martyrs of liberty. Hampton was arguing that mourning was important and the right thing to do. However, he went further in asserting that Southerners were fighting for what he viewed as a good and noble cause. Southerners as a whole should keep their heads held high and be proud that they had sought to preserve a way of life that they considered ideal. They should not feel shameful for losing the war. So what you can see in Hampton's words is that there was a shift away from simply mourning over the dead. The lost cause began to take on a more celebratory tone. One event marked the transition better than any other. That was an effort to build a monument to General Robert E. Lee. It's not surprising that Robert E. Lee would be the subject of one of the most important monuments in the South to the Civil War. For most of the conflict, Lee embodied the Southern cause. His victories made Southerners feel like victory was inevitable, and his defeats scared Southerners. His surrender at Appomattox was considered the end of the war. Most agreed that the monument should go in Richmond, which is the capital of the former Confederacy. The assembly of the sculpture was a community effort, and on May the 29th, 1890, the day of unveiling, it was a day of celebration. People from all over the South made the trip to Richmond, and the city was decorated with banners and flags, both Confederate and U.S. The city had a parade that included Confederate veterans groups, school groups, and memorial organizations. The line of nearly 20,000 people stretched for almost 4 miles. In his address, a member of the Virginia Memorial Organization called Lee the perfect union of Christian virtues and old Roman manhood. Let it stand as a great public act of thanksgiving and praise, for that it pleased Almighty God to bestow upon these Southern states a man so formed to reflect his attributes of power, majesty, and goodness. The Lee Monument was further evidence of a new direction for remembrance. It was no longer about simply bereavement, no longer simply about grief. Instead, it was increasingly about celebration. Lee, more than all others, becomes a symbol for the good in soldiers' efforts. Lee was not viewed as a leader of rebels trying to break away from the United States. Lee was not viewed as a general fighting to keep blacks enslaved, but a moral exemplar who reflected the values of Southern life. Across the South, memorial organizations erected monuments and statues to honor Confederate soldiers. Led by the UVC and the United Daughters of the Confederacy, communities raised money for large projects, and they worked to build new statues in central areas of towns. Across the South, cities and towns erected monuments on court squares and even in the middle of roads and intersections. Many look very similar, usually a single nondescript Confederate soldier standing vigilant, many times facing north. The statues became commercialized, and there were companies that specialized in specific looks. Companies even visited UCV and UDC chapters, helped them raise money. Monuments were about remembering, but also about teaching. For many Southerners who grew up after the war, a statue of a Confederate soldier was a lesson in war. One veteran asserted that books are occasionally opened. Monuments are seen every day. Now, I must note here that white supremacy was quite visible in the monument movement. For example, on October the 26th of 1875, citizens of Richmond, Virginia marched in a massive parade to celebrate the unveiling of a new monument to Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. The city was decorated with flowers, streamers, and flags along the route, and business came to a halt for the day. It's estimated that 50,000 people participated and observed the event. Along the route, the Ladies Memorial Association and the KKK erected arches and towers to celebrate Jackson. Writing on the biggest arch were the words "Warrior, Christian, Patriot," and included a saber, a Bible, and a Confederate cap. Confederate veterans, led by Jubal Early, said to Governor James Kemper that many people heard rumors that black militia would be allowed to participate. Early asserted that he was, and I quote, inexpressibly shocked by the idea. He added that black participation was an indignity to the memory of Jackson and an insult to the Confederates. How to include black Virginians was a challenge. Black militia units had actually asked to participate in the parade. Well, the governor told Early that he should just stay home, and the governor agreed to allow the blacks to march. To prevent the suggestion of race mixing, he ordered the blacks to march last in the parade and even removed the Virginia state legislature from the parade because there were still several black legislators. In the end, black units chose not to march. So I think we need to understand that memorialization through Memorial Days, grand speeches, and monument celebrations were rituals by which, as historian David Blight writes, dead continued to mingle among the living. However, as the evidence indicates, these rituals were also symbols meant to espouse white supremacy. Many white Southerners, like Jubal Early, viewed the former Confederacy and the monuments meant to remember it as symbols of racial superiority. For them, black participation in celebrations would have disgraced the memory of the fallen and for what they fought for. For others, like Kemper, black participation was welcomed, but again, only as proof that white dominance was both an ideal and accepted reality in the South. In welcoming black participation, Kemper was not suggesting racial equality, but rather as evidence that blacks had accepted their place in society and had been satisfied with the old antebellum social system. Well, from these monuments and from the Lost Cause movement, what did they want people to learn? First, remembrance of the war was going beyond simple remembering. With monuments and the celebration of the Confederate service, Southerners began to rethink the meaning of the war. As I mentioned in the beginning, one idea that emerged was the idea of the lost cause. In his book, The Lost Cause, Edward Pollard wrote in 1866 that the South may have lost on the battlefields, but they would carry on the war of ideas. The ideas behind the lost cause were once again helped by veterans organizations. In 1892, the UCV established a historical commission. On the surface, the commission was designed to preserve stories and history of soldiers who were beginning to die off. But in reality, the commission was a way to incorporate a new celebration of Confederate life with a history of the war. The commission sponsored the creation of museums, traveling exhibits, and books on the war. The commission changed the way Southerners characterized the war as well. The first key tenet was that just because Southerners had lost the war doesn't mean they were wrong. Defeat did not imply a moral or ideological fault. Second, the fact that so many died for the South shows that, regardless of outcome, the cause was just. This idea was a key part of the reinterpretation of the war. Now, a central argument of the new history of the war was that secession was the result of constitutional issues. Secession occurred because Southern states wanted to defend the rights of states against the overarching power of the federal government. In other words, they argued that the war was about states' rights. This meant to Southerners that secession had been justified as an act to protect Southern life from interference. Slavery took a back seat, which really ran counter to what prominent Southern leaders asserted back in 1861. Speaking in Savannah, Georgia, on March the 21st, 1861, Vice President of the Confederacy Alexander Hamilton Stevens asserted that the new Confederate government did not accept the assumption of equality of races. Our new government, he said, is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. When slavery was addressed after the war, some Southerners tried again to defend slavery and wrote about faithful slaves and how they protected their masters in the war. In 1896, at the reopening of the Confederate White House in Richmond, Virginia, former Confederate General Bradley Johnson asserted that slavery had been an apprenticeship by which savage races had been educated and trained into civilization by their superiors. And he also argued that the greatest crime of the century was the emancipation of the Negroes. However, what was lost to white memory were the numerous stories of slaves escaping to Union lines during the war. A Southern planter in 1865's statement that he and others were under the delusion that slaves were happy and content was placed in the record that the UDC chose not to make public. In pushing the idea that the war was over states' rights, not slavery, Southerners chose to ignore the moral implications of slavery. Slavery brought up questions of right and wrong that veterans groups thought disparaged the memory of individual soldiers. Fighting for states' rights put veterans and fallen soldiers in a long tradition of Americans, as Wade Hampton said, defending liberty. This made the war just and gave Southerners the opportunity to remember the war positively and to criticize Reconstruction, which they now could argue was simply a continuation of hostile antebellum federal policies that led to secession. The idea that the war was a war to defend states' rights even encouraged a new term for the war. Instead of the War of the Rebellion, which was the official federal term for the Civil War, the UCV and UDC encouraged war between the states. Such ideas were promoted and taught in schools. These ideas were also carved into monuments for future generations to read. Near the courthouse in Greenwood, South Carolina, the Ladies Memorial Association dedicated a monument in 1903 which reads, "Patriots who, animated by the same faith, actuated by the same love of country, beset with the same trials and dangers, enduring with the same fortitude, and fought as heroically to maintain local self-government as did the colonial fathers to attain. The same, and with them, are immortalized in the same hall of glory." In the end, many people adopted this alternate history of the war. The end of Reconstruction, in particular the end of a seemingly hostile federal presence, provided for a new opportunity, a process called reconciliation, in which Southerners and Northerners began to openly discuss the legacy of the war. Immediately after the war, there seemed to be very little chance that Confederates and Yankees would be willing to join hands and to remember the conflict. As in any civil war, hostilities lingered after the conflict ended. Emancipation and the surrender didn't make the cause of the war go away. Soldiers were divided over slavery, over secession, and the fact that the enemy had killed friends and comrades. However, time began to heal wounds. As Reconstruction seemed to work out major issues, soldiers began to focus on their common experiences. There was a sense that Confederates and Yankees had all been brave, and that they had all fought valiantly for what they thought was right. All had lost fellow soldiers. All had seen the horrors of war and lived through it. By the 1880s, soldiers on both sides began to meet. In meetings, the blue and gray focused on common experience and common needs. Instead of discussing slavery or the legitimacy of secession, they talked about heroism of the soldiers, the need for federal money for cemeteries, of pensions, of payment to widows and orphans. With reconciliation and the idea that both sides had fought the noble fight, we see reunions start to take place all over the country. The theme of these reunions was national harmony and patriotism. One of the biggest and well-known reunions occurred in 1913. Veterans and spectators came together that year to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Pickett's Charge that occurred during the Battle of Gettysburg. There were approximately 53,000 veterans at the reunion from both sides of the war. Speaking to the crowd, President Woodrow Wilson asserted that, "We have found one another again as brothers and comrades in arms, enemies no longer, generous friends rather, our battles long past, the quarrels forgotten, except that we shall not forget the splendid valor, the manly devotion of the men then arrayed against one another, now grasping hands and smiling into each other's eyes." Confederate celebration was very important to the development of the New South. It gave Southerners a past that they could be proud of, a legacy of opposition to tyranny that would stretch into the 20th century. It created a sense of pride that, despite the outcome of the war, the cause of the Confederates had been just, and by implication, that it should still be respected. The end of Reconstruction seemed to vindicate that cause. Despite a decade and a half of occupation and federal interference, Southern resistance had prevailed. Remember, the South had been redeemed. For African Americans, failure to center slavery and emancipation at the heart of the Civil War caused a serious setback in their fight for civil rights. The war, at least in the eyes of most Southerners, hadn't been a referendum on the morality of racism and subjugation. Instead, it had been a valiant fight over the rights of the South. As we continue to look at how the South changed, keep in mind the importance of the memory of the Civil War to Southern life. One of the ways that Southerners dealt with their new economy, new politics, and new society was remembering and valuing the old.